Our next speaker is Professor Saida Grundy. Saida is Assistant Professor of Sociology and African American Studies. She is a feminist sociologist of race and ethnicity. Her research to date has focused upon formations and ideologies of gender within the Black middle class, specifically men. She's currently working on a book manuscript titled Manhood Within the Margins, Making Middle-Class Masculinity at the Historically Black College for Men. Her research has been supported by the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, and the Andrew Mellon Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Professor Grundy.
Just a moment. We up? There we go. All right, let's change my view here. Sorry, I need a presenter view. So you get this twofer. Sorry, you can see my whole desktop. A little embarrassing. So you get this sociology twofer right now. Let's hope this presenter view works in the right way. Yeah, there we go. Yes, I am Saida Grundy. Until recently, I was a rookie professor here at BU in the Department of Sociology and Program in African American Studies. And I want to talk to you about citizenship. And you may think you know what citizenship is, but come be a sociology major and we'll learn you on it. That's how we speak down south. All right? So, citizenship. Think about the images you associate with citizenship. It's probably something like this, right? Or borders, visas, or tired, huddled masses seeking a new destiny on these shores. Your family may be an immigrant family. We think of citizenship primarily as it has to do with those who are coming into our population, as Professor Cabria just spoke about in terms of our immigration policies. This is an important discussion to be had. It makes us confront nationalism, race, foreign policy, militarism, globalization. But immigration is not the only issue within the broader conversation about citizenship. Citizenship is not just about adding new people to our population. It's also about how we treat groups who are already here, some of whom have been here the whole time, some since the beginning of time, and that would make us the illegal immigrants, by the way. How then can we understand the ongoing struggle for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for people who may be American by law, but who are not treated as full Americans? So yes, this is certainly about citizenship, but so is this. Who is this, by the way? My guy. I should take a knee right now. So if I told you that this too was about citizenship, you would have to understand that citizenship has multiple forms. 3 forms, actually. Not just legal, not only political, but also social. And that this latter form, social citizenship, is of the utmost importance to the other forms. Without social citizenship, the legal and political rights of millions of Americans are inaccessible at best and meaningless at worst. But Professor, isn't citizenship a messy, nuanced, hotly contested concept? However could we decide on one definition of citizenship? Well, there it is. It's in the Constitution. Halfway through the amendments and 92 years after we declared our endowment with certain inalienable rights, we finally defined a citizen. The 14th Amendment isn't only about equality for people who were formerly considered 3/5 of a human being by law, but it is also the definition of an American. The 14th Amendment proves that equality can be inscribed into the founding of a nation, but that nation can go on for a century of generations to preserve a social hierarchy of first and second class citizens, 2 Americas, stratified by race, class, gender, and sexuality. In all its constitutional beauty, the 14th Amendment has still not been fully utilized to rid our society of inequality. For that, history would leave the very people rendered social class citizens to do the work of actualizing these rights. So what do we mean by the three types of citizenship? Evelyn Nakano Glenn is a renowned sociologist of race and gender. She began her illustrious career at a little university called Boston University, in the office next to mine, which I am so proud to claim. Glenn shows us that there are multiple dimensions of citizenship, and that people can be citizens in some respect and not citizens in others. Legal rights, like being born or naturalized an American, differ from political rights, like the right to vote and be represented in government, which also differ from social rights, the recognition of your citizenship and equality by others. A formal citizen is legally granted, but substantive citizenship requires access to resources, social services, education, housing, police protection, etc. That is to say, social citizenship. This is the difference between having rights legally and politically and being able to exercise them socially. Glenn would argue that social and legal rights are certainly necessary, but they are not sufficient for people to enjoy substantive citizenship. She says, I would argue that citizenship is omni-relevant. Citizenship affects public life in such areas as political participation and development of state policy. It also affects private life, including family and interpersonal relations. Exclusion from citizenship rights interact with and magnifies other social inequalities. But just who are these groups that who have been here the whole time and who have had formal and substantive forms of citizenship withheld from them? If I asked you right now to name the first American suffrage movement, you might be a bit confused. If you are like most Americans and like most of my students in my class, you've probably only heard of one, women's suffrage, which culminated in the passing of the 19th Amendment in 1919. The image in your mind would likely and immediately go to Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and you would likely be thinking of mostly white women. Fortunately, you're only 100 years off. The first suffrage movement, which began in the 1820s, was for universal white male suffrage. In the laws of the day, only white property-owning males could vote, but white men overall, who had long enjoyed their place at the top of the race and gender hierarchy, organized to be granted the political rights that they already exercised socially and legally. Later that century, black men would be granted the vote with the passage of the 15th Amendment. Black women, then, would organize themselves into the political arena before their white suffragette counterparts through the Black Women's Club movement. Black women held newly enfranchised black men accountable as racial delegates, meaning that black men were accountable for holding the voting interests of the race on the whole. This meant that black women were actually informally involved in political citizenship long before they were formally granted the vote with the 19th Amendment. But long before Evelyn Nakano Glenn, quite a few Americans argued similarly about substantive citizenship, and more than a few were killed for it. A history of anesthetizing King's legacy has reduced his I Have a Dream speech to an innocuous vision of a hazy promised land. Far less often do we recognize that what was also in that speech, King's indictment of an American promissory note owed to African Americans. That note was the 14th Amendment, a promise made to and for the descendants of slaves that is yet to be upheld in the form of social equality. The promise of social citizenship ratified in 1868 that still hadn't been realized exactly a century later by King's assassination in 1968. King was at the forefront of an entire movement to topple the pernicious system of American apartheid that we call Jim Crow. Jim Crow laws were effectively unconstitutional and thus technically illegal under the 14th Amendment. They encoded racism to a set of de facto laws that universally penalized blackness and gave whites unearned privileges at every turn. The criminal enterprise of Southern white supremacy was allowed to legally operate for nearly a century, despite a constitution that declared racial equality, because America would not make good on its promise to African Americans. The civil rights movement was a movement for all forms of citizenship for Black Americans, but it is most strongly associated with political rights such as voting and legal access to public resources. Thus, when we think of the victories of the civil rights movement, we primarily think of legislation. But since the civil rights era, the torch of the struggle for social citizenship, the ability to exercise the rights enshrined in the Constitution, has been continually picked up by movements of marginalized peoples across the nation. We look first at First Peoples fighting for a particular kind of citizenship, one that recognizes their sovereignty, the right to self-governance, the right to their indigenous lands, to a fundamental right such as clean water, and an honored contract on American promises made to them and broken time and time again. We see solidarity across queer peoples, even white queer people, who understand their treatment as second-class citizens as linked to the fates of Black lives, and recognize that Black and brown queer people are doubly penalized into third-class citizenship in this country. We look at Black Lives Matter, and we see that 148 years since the 14th Amendment, it is still asking for delivery on America's promissory note, that certificate of assurance that Black people may have a right to be Black and trans at the same time, to be Black on the sidewalk, to have the Bill of Rights apply to them, and to have forms of protection by and from the state that are granted to every other type of full citizen in America. Within the Black Lives Matter movement lies the totality of our demands for social citizenship, the unfinished follow-up to the fundamental American question that was left unresolved and unacknowledged in 1776 and unenforced and undermined since 1868. In just a few recent short years, we have watched the Black Lives Matter movement take center stage at both parties' political conventions. We see it swiftly sweep its hands over higher education, calling for the termination of college administrators who would see people of color as second-class students and faculty. We see the unwavering demand to remove from our campus buildings and monuments the names of men whose fortunes were built upon reprehensible forms of inhumanity and slavery. To dismiss these as simply forms of youthful racial unrest, or worse, criminality and lawlessness, is to deny how inextricably American it is to insist upon full and robust social citizenship. Our students may not only create a better America than ours, but you may also prove to be better, fuller Americans than us. And surely history will remember you as such. Thank you. I will leave this up. Don't give me hard questions, really, no.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you for your talk. It was great. I guess my question is, the 14th Amendment did grant social citizenship to all Americans, and yet many of the things like necessary to enact social citizenship, welfare,
Absolutely.
and things like that are like under the control of like states and things like that. So how do we like mitigate that problem?
So one is in recognizing that a piece of legislation, which is what the 14th Amendment was, it encodes social citizenship, right? Well, it grants legal citizenship and encodes social citizenship. But if you've ever taken a basic political science course, you know that laws are nothing if they're not enforced, right? Laws are actually meaningless if they're not enforced. So what we have since that time is an entire system to undermine the 14th Amendment. I mean, we are arguing the 14th Amendment for marriage equality as recently as a couple of years ago, something that has been on the books for 148 years. So when you talk about the state, what we have, I mean, in short, is that there are those in America who believe that citizenship is a zero-sum game. If others get it, they lose it, right? They don't see it as sort of a pie that gets larger. They see it as a pie that's sliced up. And if you take a piece, I don't get a piece. So when we talk about incentives of the state, both intentional and unintentional, because systemic racism, systemic homophobia, all these things can operate unintentionally, we're talking about a system that has basically operated on autopilot since slavery. It takes much more effort to undo those operations of the state than it does. The state will continue to reproduce itself. The country was founded on social inequality, so it's nothing to continue operating on social inequality. It takes much more effort to undo those processes.
Hi, thanks for your talk. We had a wonderful discussion last Friday at the Howard Thurman Center about Colin Kaepernick and his decision to kneel during the national anthem, during the national football game. And my question to you is, what would you respond to those who say that isn't the time for that kind of protest? Or even during September 11th, when some players decided not to stand or hold their hands to their hearts. What is your response to that? Thank you.
I saw a wonderful meme, a wonderful tweet that I cannot take credit for. Look, I don't even know what this Twitter thing is. But I saw a wonderful tweet that I cannot take credit for that said, something, we stand, they're mad, we sit, they're mad, we protest, they're mad, we die, they're silent, right? And I think that first of all, that should replace a number of social history books we have in America's public schools, but also that pretty much encapsulates for me that this idea that there has ever been a correct way to protest is completely a fallacy. In any way that you resist racial inequality, social inequality, those in power will always tell you, when is it ever the time to lose power, right? They will always tell you that what you're doing is disrespectful. Here's what's fascinating about Kaepernick. If it was so disrespectful, why didn't you notice until a reporter asked him about it? It was so disrespectful, he'd been doing it for many games and no one noticed until he said something that explained his actions. So this idea that there is a way to protest, that's a fallacy. When we were marching silently, they killed us. When we were sitting at Woolworth's counters, they killed us. When we were fighting for indigenous lands, they killed us. There is no appropriate way.
Hi. Oh, is it on? I can just project. Yeah. So for another kind of group of people, like as we know, that are also don't. Can you hear me?
Yeah, a little bit. Go ahead.
That also are not granted this total citizenship, formerly incarcerated individuals.
Yes,
Okay,
thank
yeah.
Thank
So
you.
particularly formerly incarcerated Black and brown men, how do we kind of go about achieving justice and citizenship for them when there's
This is so important. This is so important. First of all, do you all understand that the entire concept of mass incarceration, what it means is that you're no longer locking up a crime, you're locking up entire groups of people. That's what mass incarceration means. Mass incarceration for Black males has become an inheritable trait. You are more likely to go to prison if your father went to prison. Where white men inherit wealth, Black men are inheriting prison, right? This is what we understand about mass incarceration. It is not only social disenfranchisement, it is legal disenfranchisement. You are denying, in fact, Massachusetts has fairly good laws about this, but in many states, including Kentucky, there's a very long reenfranchisement process, but we have one. In many states, I'm just going to put Florida up there, you can no longer, once you are a felon, once you are a convicted felon, you cannot vote for the rest of your life. This is what this means. First of all, you're making sure that 2 million Americans can't vote, 800,000 of whom are Black men. Now, we know all the efforts that are done to disenfranchise Black people. In fact, recently North Carolina Supreme Court ruled that it was, what do they say? It was moon landing like precision for surgical precision, thank you, in terms of the efforts taken to construct a voting identity fraud policy that would disenfranchise Black people. We have members of the GOP now very, candidly saying, well, if Black people voted Republican, you wouldn't see these fraud laws, right? When we're talking about mass incarceration, we have to put that in the context of that. And we're not just talking about voting rights. We're also talking about the right to work, right? You all know the movement Ban the Box. Ban the Box is the idea that once you are a felon, you always have to check the felony box. Well, when felons can't get jobs, what do you go back to? You go back to an untaxed economy. You go back to an economy that will hire you, right? Informally and formally. We're talking about a denial of basic American rights that is for life, even though we call these correctional facilities and say that people have served their time. And then we, of course, have a two-tiered criminal justice system in which, you know, the privileged are not getting at all the types of sentencing that black and brown people are getting for, you know, minor nonviolent drug infractions, right?
Hello. Yeah. Thank you so much for your talk. Among the many things that I do not understand about the American society, there's one thing that has bothered me a lot over the past 4 years that I've been here, is that why is it that our black friends who were born in America, who have been, been here for a very long time, still referred to as African Americans and not just Americans? That doesn't happen with a lot of other groups.
We used to be referred to as other things.
Right.
So to give you a brief history of all the other things we were referred to, we actually fought for that African American distinction. My mother was born a Negro. In fact, she might have been born colored. My parents were colored at birth, and now they're African American. Some people, I had a teacher who say, I became Hispanic in 1984. I don't even know what it means, right? Ronald Reagan made me Hispanic. But there was actually a term we fought for because we, wanted to self-determine our own name. That was a name that we wanted for ourselves. It was a move away from simply Negro. It was a move away from colored. All these things that defined us in proximity to, not proximity, in contrast to whiteness. But the question of hyphenated Americans is a good one, right? To the issue of plurality, we have to recognize that in America, these ways in which we are American may be encoded equally constitutionally, but they are not practiced equally, right? And so we have to have a way to acknowledge the different kinds of Americanness that we confront on a daily basis. With the hyphens, though, that should not leave whiteness as normal, right? You know, when I was growing up, and I'm from Kentucky, so forgive me, but when you asked my white classmates, what race are you? They said American, not a race, right? The idea then was that whiteness was normalized into Americanness and that everyone else was a deviation from Americanness. So yeah, I definitely identify as black and African American. Those are, but not all black people, of course, are African American. We're Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Canadian. We are African continental. We are indigenous Australians. Black people are all over the diaspora. In this country, though, that was definitely a term that we fought for in a number of movements, but it could also change. In this next iteration of blackness, that could also change.